Today's speaker has a lot to say about topics that I think will be of interest to all of us. He's Liam Henihan, an ecosystem ecologist working at DePaul University, where he is a professor of environmental science and co-director of DePaul's Institute for Nature and Culture. The Institute is a response both to a crisis of vision and leadership within environmentalism and to the opportunities represented by the emerging disciplines of urban ecology and environmental restoration that have been pioneered here in Chicago. His research has included studies on the impact of acid rain on soil food webs in Europe and interbiome comparisons of decomposition and nutrient dynamics in forested ecosystems of North America and the tropics. He and his students have worked on a variety of restoration issues in Midwestern ecosystems. In addition to being a scientist, he's a graduate student in philosophy and an occasional poet. And for me as a librarian, I'm especially looking forward to his talk today about green themes in children's literature. He will reveal for us the environmental foundations of classic children's literature, explaining how often complex themes of our dependence upon and destruction of nature surface in stories written for children. And when we're aware of these green themes, we can help young readers prepare to become more environmentally literate and better prepared for the environmental challenges of the coming decade. Please join me in welcoming Liam Henihan.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure to get an opportunity to chat with you this morning. Let me just start. Once upon a time, there was a princess who lived on a small blue-green world that orbited a medium-sized but feisty sun. Now, this particular princess came from a long line of primates that had evolved slowly on the equatorial bands of her world. She was fangless and clawless, relatively hairless, and alas, several very formidable cats had discovered that her kind was remarkably tasty. But the princess possessed a remarkable gift. She could imagine the future. After consulting with her scientists, she learned that one day that she must die, just as the scientists too must surely die. Moreover, she learned that everything that lives must perish. She learned too that the feisty sun that shone so gaily in the sky would steadily increase in luminosity and one day would engulf the small blue-green planet. The princess placed her forehead in her hands and she wept. After a while, her weeping turned to a quiet sobbing, and the sobbing became a mild shuddering, and eventually the shuddering came to an end. The princess looked up and saw a child pass by where she sat, and knowing that the child too must die, she spoke to the child, saying, once upon a time there was a ferocious cat. Once upon a time there were 3 bears. Once upon a time there was a woodcutter with a beautiful daughter. Once upon a time there was an ogre who loved flowers. Once upon a time there was a princess. Once upon a time. That's the slide that should have gone with that story. You know, it's sometimes consoling to learn that it's not just environmental scientists and ecologists who are kind of perplexed and worried about the future. There's, in fact, a kind of a whole emerging science at the moment devoted to thinking about the calamitous ways in which everything ends. One of the people whose work on this topic I find particularly appealing is a guy called Nick Bostrom in Oxford. He's a philosopher, and he's kind of organized a number of groups both in Oxford and Cambridge, kind of looking at what he describes as global risk, particularly global existential risk, global catastrophic risk. So what those groups have been doing is kind of looking at the ways in which, you know, very often kind of some natural phenomenon, the sun increasing in luminosity, engulfing the world eventually, but also maybe kind of a particular interest to us is the way in which we ourselves might do ourselves in. So they're trying to categorize these risks. In his volume, an edited volume on global catastrophic risk, He evaluates the risk based upon two factors. One is the scope of the crisis, and the other is the severity. By scope, this is on the kind of y-axis here, is whether it is transgenerational. If you have a potential catastrophic problem that is going to last, beyond a single generation, or even is cosmic in scope, that's the axis. That's the y-axis on this diagram. On the x-axis is the severity of the crisis, which kind of goes at the kind of lower end to imperceptible. Let's say a hair falls out of your head. It's not really a problem. It's imperceptible. But those problems that are ultimately terminal, that kind of do us in, those are the ones that we have to worry about. So using this matrix, they've been trying to ascertain essentially what they describe as existential risks. Existential risks are ones where the outcome would annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life permanently or drastically limit its potential. The good news is that environmental stuff, tend not to be as potentially calamitous as some of the things that this group are working on. So they, for instance, and this is a sobering diagram. I don't mean to kind of bring us all down on a Sunday morning, but here it is. Here are the risks that they assess as having the possibility of bringing about human extinction by the year 2100. For instance, molecular nanotechnology is really up there, a 5% risk. Maybe more kind of familiar ones, super intelligent AI, creating things, creating kind of intelligences that decide that we are kind of not worthy of this planet, pulling the plug on us. And then kind of more familiar things like global wars, engineered pandemics, and the like. So as I said, it's kind of, generally speaking, environmental problems are considered, climate change, biodiversity loss, problems with the nitrogen cycle. These are all problems that are considered to be transgenerational, but probably survivable, right? Probably survivable. Maybe we don't particularly find the future, in which we kind of go over a threshold with climate change that may not be particularly palatable, but we'll probably survive it. And just to give you kind of a sense of what these environmental, perhaps tolerable, but certainly momentous problems. I really like this paragraph by David Orr, who's an environmental sustainability professor at Oberlin College. In 1992, presumably he's working this in the early 90s, he estimated like a typical day on Earth. If today is a typical day on Earth, he says that humans will add 15 million tons of carbon to the atmosphere, destroy 115 square miles of tropical rainforest, create 72 square miles of desert, eliminate between 40 to 100 species, erode 71 million tons of topsoil, add 2,700 tons of CFCs, which adversely affect the ozone layer to the stratosphere, and increase their population by 263,000 each day, day after day, and day after day. In fact, I don't have it reproduced here, but at the end of this paragraph, he says we've got about 20 years to remediate some of these problems, or else we are kind of approaching kind of a real environmental crisis. I recalculated last summer, his typical day on Earth, and the news is not good. All of the things that he was writing about, for the most part have been exacerbated. So for instance, but there's some good news, right? We have done a pretty good job at curtailing CFC production. Ozone is not as much in the news as it was, but for the most part, pretty much every kind of major factor that he looked at in '92 is getting worse. So I'll just read kind of the update. Thus, if today is a typical day on Earth, we will add 24 million metric tons of carbon to the atmosphere, destroy 137.5 square miles of forest, eliminate dozens of species. Incidentally, it turns out that's a much more difficult calculation to make than or thought at the time. It's really so. Global loss of biodiversity is potentially catastrophic for us, and yet at the same time, we don't know. Just listen to this. We don't know to the nearest order of magnitude how first of all, how many species there are on Earth. So we don't know to the nearest order of magnitude how many species there are on Earth, nor do we know, how many species are going missing kind of daily, never mind like an annual basis. But we do know that, we are kind of closing in on what's known as the sixth mass extinction. The rate at which we're losing species at the moment rivals the rate at which species disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous. So at the end of the Cretaceous, as you know, the meteorite, comet, or whatever it was that hit the Earth that took out the dinosaurs, we are the comet. We are the comet, taking out that level of those number of species. And by the way, we're increasing our population by 226,000. So we're doing a little bit better in terms of population growth. Bad news is that I recalculated the rate of growth at the time that Orr made his calculation, and he made a slight, well, he didn't make an error, it's just that the data are better now, even retroactively. So even though the rate of population growth is going down, the absolute numbers are pretty much staying the same because of the enormity of the global population. So we got problems. One way of synthesizing these problems, I kind of like this approach. It's just emerging. This is from Will Stephan and his group earlier in 2015. It's called the planetary boundaries approach. So what Will Stephan and a pretty large group of researchers have been trying to do is ascertain kind of where we are in terms of critical global thresholds in terms of biogeochemistry, kind of alterations to the nitrogen cycle, genetic diversity, and the like. And for some things, we're doing fine. But for a lot of them, we are breaching kind of the planetary boundary, and that's a problem. One way of synthesizing this is that, folks in environmental circles, but also some of the geologists are prepared to accept this new name for our era, the Anthropocene, which would be the suggestion being that the era that we are experiencing on Earth, one influenced by human modification of the environment, deserves, and it's a new geological era. So, fortunately, like over the last 40 years or so, 45 years, there's been an increasing awareness about these problems, and we are kind of hopeful, right, that with enough literacy about these problems that we will be able to avert some of these calamitous outcomes. Hasn't worked so well over the last 25 years, but we can still be optimistic. And the literature on environmental literacy is growing. The term was first introduced, as I mentioned on this slide, about 45 years ago. And the kind of the important question here is, how much do each and every one of us have to know about environmental problems in order to be an environmentally literate person? So over the last 45 years, academics being academics, there's a sprawling literature on exactly what it is that we need to know. I direct your attention to line number 2. No, I'm kidding. So it's a little impenetrable. But essentially, these are the factors, and I've amended them a little bit. So in order for us to be sufficiently environmentally literate to address some of the potentially calamitous problems that I've been discussing, we need education along these different axes. One is the first one is this notion of affect, right? It's a term imported from environmental psychology. So the idea would be that in order to kind of think about addressing problems, we at least have to have some sensitivity to those problems. We have to be sensitive to the environment. I've expanded this term a little bit, and I kind of like the term attunement. So nobody's going to solve an environmental problem that does not feel in some way inclined towards the natural world. One needs to kind of, maybe not love, I would say love, but one has to certainly incline positively towards the world around us in order to do anything about it. One needs very specific ecological knowledge. You need basic natural history knowledge about the things of the world and also the processes that connect them, ecosystem processes, evolutionary processes, and the like. This is the one, by the way, that the ecologists spend most time on. Just thinking about, how much does one need to know about food webs? How much does one need to know about global biogeochemical cycles and the like? And it turns out that's a pretty long list. Our colleagues in environmental social science, of course, would remind us that we also need to kind of understand the degree to which our problems are embedded in a social matrix. One needs to understand the socio-political dimensions of our problem. How do our decisions affect the way in which we govern the resources that surround us? We have to know something about, the specifics of the problem, right? So it's not just enough to know that kind of nature is important to us and know the degree to which we're dependent upon critical processes. We have to know kind of precisely what those problems are. The list is getting long, and one needs, of course, like to have the critical cognitive skills to kind of think our way through problem solving. A lot of environmental literacy advocates would remind us that, you have to know something about the scientific method. You have to know how to go about kind of formulating hypotheses about the world or conjectures about the way the world works, and you have to be able to evaluate data in order to see whether your conjectures about the world are correct or not. You have then, on top of all of this, right, you've got to know kind of what environmentally responsible behavior is. These days we frame it in terms of sustainability activity. But, there's older terms for that. Essentially, environmentally responsible behavior. How do you go about solving these problems? And then there's some other terms that come in, additional determinants of environmentally responsible behaviors. I kind of just like this because it's the reminder that, people have to feel, when you are confronted by this kind of rather glum news and this huge edifice of learning that one has to take on board in order to approach them, you have to feel, right, that you have some impact upon the world. So those of us who feel that we are utterly insignificant, and that our activities really don't matter, those, frankly, are not the people necessarily that are going to solve our problems. The other two things that I would throw in to the mix is that, there are some important environmental themes that kind of get left out of discussions of environmental literacy, including kind of an understanding and appreciation of the idea of wilderness, and maybe more invisible, so the idea, what is the role of wilderness thinking in our kind of attunement to the world. Much more invisible than that, but I would say kind of equally important. It just gets written out of a lot of environmental literature, environmental thinking, is the notion of the pastoral, or pastoral, as people in this part of the world seem to pronounce it. So pastoral is this idea that there is a potential kind of moment of harmony between people and the rest of the world. So that's kind of the very, very glum setting for the what I wanted to talk to you about this morning. When I talk to my students, I say that environmental science kind of has two moods. One is melancholy, it's extremely melancholy, where we take a kind of a cold, hard stare at the state of the world. But the other kind of face of environmental thought, the other mood, is one of jubilation and awe, which I, noticed came up in Kara's kind of presentation of what ethical humanism is about. And in environmental science is kind of founded in awe about the world. And if you doubt that, just go back and look at some old David Attenborough, videos, just to remind you that sense of kind of connection with a bigger thing is important. So I'm primarily concerned, of course, for the next 20 minutes or so, just to talk about some of the more positive things, and that really is the foundation of this project that I've been working on. So the project is called Beasts at Bedtime. I'm kind of looking at the degree to which we can use classic children's literature in order to educate for sustainability. So how do we think about kind of communicating all of these components of ecological literacy to our children without being kind of, grinding them into the ground with depression? So the idea, of course, is that you can do this through literature. However, before getting on to the kind of more jubilant part of this, problem is, we're not awfully sure, right, that we're not awfully confident about our children's future either. So there's a kind of weird simultaneous crisis between the Earth and our confidence about the future and our confidence about what's kind of going on with our children. Just to illustrate this point, a number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago at this point, the Oxford Children's Dictionary had some choices to make about... so the Children's Dictionary is limited in the number of words that it can put into their dictionary. I don't remember the number, maybe like 100,000 or so. So when they want to introduce new terms to the dictionary, they've got to make decisions about the ones that they're going to jettison. And so in their last round, they jettisoned, lobsters and starlings and dandelions, and I think mushrooms or toadstools went as well. And you might love this. They, it's coming up here. Yeah, in place of the blackberry as that lovely little piece of fruit, they have substituted with BlackBerry as in the telephone. Blogs are in. Bungee jumping has finally made it to the... So the general concern, right, is that our children are kind of less and less connected to nature at a time when they will kind of shoulder the responsibility for for our environmental future. So we're kind of confident in them, and yet at the same time there is this kind of concern that there is a crisis in the way in which they're interacting with the world. More than anything else, it's been crystallized, this concern has been crystallized in Richard Louv's book. Richard Louv is a journalist who wrote the book Last Child in the Woods. He coined the term nature deficit disorder. And the essential thesis is that kids are spending so much time inside in front of their small little screens that they are kind of not getting kind of the necessary vitamin N that they need from interaction with the outside world. And as a consequence, this is real consequences. There are crises with attention deficit disorder, obesity, and kind of even empathy and things like that are kind of hypothesized as being kind of connected with this lack of contact with nature. And if you're interested, I have a lot more to say about, there really is an emerging discipline over the last 15 to 20 years looking at, the very concrete ways in which kind of a lack of contact with nature, has implications physiologically and psychologically, not just for children, but for us as well. So the solution, according to Louv, and it's kind of gets reflected in programming, even here in Chicago, the Leave No Child Inside program, for instance, the solution is to send kids out of doors. So I'm absolutely kind of in favor of that. It's, why wouldn't one be? And yet at the same time, I am kind of offering kind of a complementary project to Louv's, based upon the recognition that ultimately we come home. Like, it's not like we don't have an indoor life. And if we want to, on the one hand, enrich our experience of the out of doors, we also have to kind of enrich the quality of our reflective experience, which often occurs at home. Even that inveterate walker, Thoreau, who's pretty influential in my world, he mentions that, you know, he has to walk at least 4 hours a day. But the reality, of course, is that, you know, and if you think about Darwin and Wallace and like all of our kind of great environmental science heroes, I mean, a lot of the work, of course, is based upon, a lot of their insights is based upon the quality of experience kind of going out into the world. But yet at the same time, Thoreau comes home. And those of you who are Thoreau fans will probably kind of recognize that a lot of the important work that, a lot of the important messages that Thoreau has for us are in the journals, not just in kind of Walden or, you know, the essays. The journals are, there's 1 million words in Thoreau's journals written over a period of about 20 years or so. At the rate at which I write, at least, that's like 15 solid years, you know, I would be doing nothing other than working on that journal in order to create it. Same with Darwin. Darwin goes off on the Beagle for a couple of years, comes back and spends decades reflecting upon that experience. So what I'm kind of suggesting is that, you know, in our kind of concern about kind of educating for the environment, we can't just push the idea of kind of spontaneous play outside or interaction in the kind of woodlands. We also have to change the quality of the reflective environment at home. And a lot of that kind of reflection is done, you know, with a parent and child, with a teacher and a child over loved books. And, you know, these are my own kids. They're certainly very reflective of our, you know, of the world that we're living in. Myself and Vasya, my wife, have been, you know, concerned, of course, over the years that they, like, you know, we want them to go out more. They wanted to stay in more. They're grown up now. The fisherman on the left is 24, and the gamer on the right is now 20. But they were typical of their generation. They had their phones. They kind of spend a lot of time with their screens. And I would say, you know, not to make this too personal, but both Vasya and I are pretty pleased with the outcome. I think they're kind of, generally speaking, pretty ethical, informed citizens. So, you know, it's certainly not like a guarantee, right, that if kids like stay at home, don't go out so much, that it's going to irrevocably do them damage. Both of these guys are kind of concerned about environmental stuff. In fact, the little fellow on the right is an environmental science minor. The guy on the left is a philosopher, so I don't know what we did there. But anyway, so part of what I've been working on over the last year with this book on children's literature, you know, to some extent is kind of the reflections of an empty nester, right? I'm kind of thinking back a little bit nostalgically, perhaps, about kind of books that were formative for them, and then, like, you know, what were the messages that they got through them, and then hoping to kind of formalize those messages a little bit. And I would say, and maybe this is quite an important point, that, you know, as an environmental scientist, as an ecologist, you know, I was picking books for them over the years, you know, picking them up at environmental conferences, you know, so very specifically placing in front of them kind of books that delivered kind of an environmental curriculum. So, for instance, on the left, this really nice book, I don't know how broadly read it is, The Great Green Forest, by Paul Geraghty, who's South African, just about tropical rainforest deforestation, you know, little glum and depressing. But the mouse in it does, the tree mouse does hold off tropical forest deforestation, so that was pretty good. But for the most part, and as I said, I think this is kind of important, is that they read pretty much the same thing that, you know, all kids read. As youngsters, they were kind of consumed with nursery rhymes, and then went through all the Harry Potters, et cetera, et cetera. So I am kind of concerned in this project about kind of looking at, you know, books, looking at the books that are typically read, very often classical literature, although I'm expanding the range a little bit, with the hypothesis that embedded in these books, in these classic books, is an environmental curriculum that pretty much kind of maps onto some of these major themes in environmental literacy. So there's no real need. This is, I would argue to you, that there's no real need to kind of develop a very specialized reading list in order for kids to appreciate, you know, the environment and what they have to do in order to kind of purchase for us a brighter environmental future. You know, most of the books that we kind of recommend to our children are, of course, ones that we recommend because they're just good stories. So the environmental themes are often organically embedded into the narrative of the stories themselves. A lot of these books are not necessarily didactic. Some of them are just, you know, scolding and telling us exactly what needs to be done. But for the most part, that's not the case. And the other thing, you know, we can talk about it more later if needs be, but of course the style of content and the type of content changes with the grade of the book. Just if you're interested in seeing how the sausage is made, you know, there is kind of so just as a kind of methodological statement. What I wanted to do was like take each of the components of environmental literacy, as I talked about a few minutes ago, and see where they occur in classic children's literature. So formally, this is what you would call like a content analysis, which is maybe just a little more than a fancy term for reading, but it's kind of it's reading with a purpose. I remember a few years ago I asked a kind of a favorite scholar of mine, you know, what his methodology was. He was kind of a philosophically inclined political writer, and he ruminated about it for a moment, and he said, I read slowly. And I think that, you know, there's more to that than maybe initially meets the eye. So a content analysis is basically kind of sampling a group of texts and kind of applying them to kind of address a particular hypothesis. It does get a little bit complicated. I could leave this up for 10 minutes and it may not be any clearer to you because it's the literature on content analysis, the specifics of like how you go about testing hypotheses just by reading is actually pretty complicated. But just to kind of give you kind of a suggestion here, you know, what's important is that, you know, you have a pretty good comprehensive sample of the literature, that you have in mind kind of how much of them you're going to read, how you're going to extract the data, how ultimately you're going to infer results. For the most part, the books that I'm talking about, you know, I've read them and my students have read them in detail. So I kind of started this project. It's expanded a little bit. I was interested in kind of looking at, you know, books that are most often recommended by librarians and let's hear it for librarians. For librarians and teachers, I'm working at the moment. Just started to work with one of the purchasing managers for the Chicago Public School, or the public library system. So we can identify, you know, not just kind of the books that maybe are kind of guilty reads for children, but, you know, when teachers are recommending and when librarians are recommending books to children, what are the classics? So some of them are real classics. So Charlotte's Web, Where Wild Things Are, Giving Tree, Polar Express, all of those sort of things. I started with about 100. The list is up to about 150 or so of books that we've been going through for this, doing this content analysis. Kind of a word of warning, like, you know, when you go looking for it, of course, pretty much every book has something environmental about it. This is Sam Beckett's great but completely inscrutable third novel in his series. This is called The Unnameable. I don't know if you've read that book recently, but it's hard to know whether the narrator has a body. It's hard to know whether the place that he's narrating for actually exists. It's a long, rambling meditation on everything. I would recommend it. I'm not maybe doing it justice, but I would recommend it. But of course, when you go looking there are kind of environmentally relevant stuff. But to be honest, like what I'm trying to avoid is kind of overly reading these books. So I'm not really trying to ferret out things in children's books that don't fully exist. So I'm going to run through kind of some of these examples for you, not saying a huge amount about any one of these aspects of environmental literacy, but just to give you a flavor of it. Of course, a lot of us do kind of develop an attunement to a certain style of thinking about the environment late in life. This is a classic moment, for instance, for Aldo Leopold, the great Wisconsin landscape biologist and environmental ethicist. He was certainly environmentally aware kind of all of his adult life, but he does arrive at this special point kind of in his adulthood when he has shot a wolf and he sees the fierce green fire dying in her eyes. Notice a lot of people can't read this without weeping a little bit. It is kind of this special moment for Aldo Leopold where he becomes attuned to nature in a way that he hadn't before. But, for this project, I'm kind of interested, of course, more in those moments, like for children, like when they become, what are those moments? What are those moments in the stories that they read where these themes become important? And, maybe it's obvious, but it stands up to scrutiny that most nursery rhymes are kind of set outdoors, right? A lot of them are very explicitly nature themed. When I went back, this is the volume that our kids read. It's a classic nursery rhyme collection with these brilliant, lovely illustrations by Eric Kincaid, who also did the selection. But in 118 rhymes, all but 23 of them are set outside. Many, almost a majority, but shy of a majority, have animals, pigs, birds, dogs, cats. And then the ones that don't, a lot of them, not as often, feature plants, or else feature kind of some interesting, strange encounter with nature. So, for instance, Little Miss Moffat, of course, telling another tale, but also critically kind of using kind of that encounter with a spider. What else do I have here? Some of them are kind of just an encounter with the wonder of the world. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, I see the moon, and the moon sees me. Or the one to the right here, which is absolutely my favorite nursery rhyme. One misty, moisty morning, when cloudy was the weather, there I met an old man clothed all in leather. Clothed all in leather with a cap under his chin. How do you do? How do you do? And how do you do again? So these kind of strange little moments. Some centered around plants, and one even, at a stretch, perhaps counseling family planning. There was an old woman who lived in the shoe. I don't think I taught that lesson that particular way. But and again, it gets kind of richer. Those of you who are kind of Tolkien fans, Tolkien himself was pretty explicit about kind of his advocacy for conservation in England, conservation of landscapes, particularly drawn to the importance of trees. And trees play a kind of an odd role, both kind of positive and negative, as forests typically do in books. I just love this. I'm throwing it up because this was the original review of The Hobbit in the New York Times in 1938 by Anne Eaton. She says, after the dwarfs and Bilbo have passed the last homely house, their way led through Wilderland. Wilderland is fairy, yet it has an earthly quality, the scent of trees, drenching rains, and the smell of wood fires. And I certainly know, the reason why I'm lingering on this for a moment or two, this was, for me, it was the first book that I ever had the sense of owning. And in fact, the illustration there is from my copy of it that my dad bought for me when I was about 8 or 9. And I had a school teacher who read this book as a reward at the end of each day. And honestly, we were so taken with this book that our behavior was just a tiny bit better because of it. But looking back, and maybe you have these moments as well, that this book, powerfully inclined me towards a certain experience of nature. Of course, in my case, you know, I grew up in Ireland. I'm from Dublin, and Celtic mythology, tales, fairy tales from Ireland has had a huge impact on me, and still does on Irish children. This is a beautiful illustration on the right from Arthur Rackham, great early 20th century illustrator. But a lot of these classic Irish fairy tales, this is from Tuan McCarroll, an illustration of the first Irishman who ends up getting into the very peculiar food web. He kind of changes into a bear, into a deer, ultimately into a fish that gets caught and is eaten by the kind of the wife of Tuan McCarroll, becomes Tuan McCarroll's. It's complicated, but so this kind of notion of kind of a thin barrier between ourselves and the natural world even pops up, of course, in Harry Potter. I was a little reluctant. I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan. Maybe that's a controversial thing to say. I read the first volume with our kids. Didn't love it. But since I've been writing this book, I've come back to it, and in fact, it is powerfully themed with nature, and I can say more about that if you're interested. So plenty of books that have kind of embedded ecological knowledge. Some writers are very, very specific about, the factual accuracy. Even if they're taking liberties with the facts of natural history, they try and get as close to right as possible. I love Janelle Cannon, who wrote the Stella Luna series. She did spent a lot of time looking at bats, spends a lot of time looking at, zoo animals and the like to get the behavior right. And in fact, Stella Luna won like a bat conservation award, so important. Even books as simple as Eric Carle's The Very Hungry Caterpillar has a certain type of a food web message for us. Ecological knowledge, of course, becomes complex and interesting and useful in work by Jean Craighead George, who wrote Julie of the Wolves, which I know is still a big favorite. And I don't know the degree to which My Side of the Mountain is still read, but it certainly has had like a huge influence. Sam out in the wilderness, learning the skills that it takes to survive up in kind of rural upstate New York. Important stuff. It influenced John F. Kennedy, who I think had a yen for falconry after reading this book, and so forth. Environmentally responsible behaviors, again, all over the place. Beautiful, sad story, the little prince, with this beautiful sentiment. Is probably the most quoted line from the book, where the fox says to the little prince, "People have forgotten this truth," the fox said, "but you mustn't forget it. You become responsible forever for whatever you've tamed. You are responsible for your rose." And I would say since we've tamed this world around us, if that message is true, we have a certain responsibility for it. The classic book on kind of environmentally responsible behavior, though it has a kind of a sad ending in some ways, a very kind of tenuous ending, is the Lorax. The Lorax worries me a little bit because it in some ways pretty much all of the advocacy in the book doesn't succeed. But we are left at the end of the book with the child with the seed, and maybe kind of some suggestion of promise in the future. I'm going to end with just like a reflection or two on some of the special themes that kind of bubble up. This is important to me because a lot of the books for children reflect on either wilderness or kind of more pastoral, rural scenes. My students at the moment are reading Hatchet. They'd wondered why. A lot of them had read it in middle school. But of course, it's a powerful book about kind of the survival of this Brian, who crashes in the Canadian wilderness. And like My Side of the Mountain, he develops the skills that it takes, develops the ecological knowledge that keeps him alive. A much bleaker book, but I still think well worth reading, is William Golding's Lord of the Flies, where it is very complex in its reflection on certain socio-political realities. Again, there's a lot to be said about all of these, but I'm going to just get through them pretty quickly. This, I've spent the last summer kind of working on a set of chapters for this book on the pastoral, thinking that it would take me about 2 or 3 weeks. It's taken me about 4 or 5 months, because the pastoral is that kind of hidden theme in environmental thought. There are so many more children's books that reflect upon gardens, the secret gardens, the occurrence of gardens in so many fairy tales, and of course classic kind of pastoral but frontier, reflections like The Little House on the prairie. Of course, that kind of the ultimate pastoral, in as much as the pastoral reflects on rural life. The most compelling meditation, I think, on the inevitability of death, even in the perfect pastoral story, is found in Charlotte's Web. So, kind of wrapping up here a little bit, I'm hoping that I'm kind of making the case that there is this obvious organic environmental content in a lot of these stories. So in some ways, this should be kind of that optimistic moment, right? That armed with a library of these books that children want to read already, they are de facto kind of given this environmental curriculum. However, when kids read and reflect upon work or discuss books that they love with their parents and teachers, it requires, like the guardian, to have a pretty good knowledge themselves of how to contextualize these themes. And unfortunately, right, the evidence is pretty good, repeated kind of surveys on the level of environmental literacy amongst, adult Americans reveals, and this will be true, I think, in Europe as well, that about 1/3 of adults have basic environmental literacy skills. So without a parent and guardian to kind of help unpack these themes, these books are falling, the environmental themes are falling on deaf ears. So the challenge ahead is that, listen, we're living in a world in flames. There's no two ways about it. Like the environmental crisis, is very real, has very kind of large implications. Simultaneously, there's a perception, at least, that there's a crisis with kids' contact with nature, which has ramifications for their health and well-being. Adult environmental literacy is pretty low. So we need to kind of simultaneously work on all of these fronts, which is, I guess, what I'm ultimately interested in. The bright news maybe is that, there is this environmental curriculum to be had in books, and, so the book ultimately is directed towards parents and guardians. So the work that I'm doing is really ultimately to simultaneously explicate these themes in books while enhancing people's environmental literacy for those that are interested. I'm going to end with just this short little story, kind of about a year or so ago in Evanston. I was up on Central Street in Evanston, and I see a dad with his son, and a little sparrow kind of like hops onto the pavement. And the kid stops, kind of like, almost like a little kind of hunter dog. He kind of crouches down, he looks at the sparrow, and his dad kind of leans into him and says, in his best David Attenborough voice, "I think it's a sparrow." And for me, it was kind of, the beauty of that moment, at least from my perspective, is that, those possibilities for all still exist. And that as kids kind of, who have a natural gravitation, it would seem, to natural things, parents can both learn from their children's kind of awe of the world around them, and yet at the same time, if well prepared, that they can, in fact, prepare them for the future. So thanks a lot. I appreciate your attention.
Hi, a very informative talk. I noticed many of your books are from the 50s.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting because when we were raising our children in the 60s and 70s, those were
Right.
the books. But my question too is, do you think that with the lack of reading books now, that programs like Nature and Oregon's Park and so forth is substituting for exposing kids to the idea of animals and nature and so forth?
Yeah, I've been real interested since starting this project, just thinking a little bit about the way in which nature programs, outdoor nature programs kind of around Chicago are integrating kind of reading as part of that program. And in fact, it's kind of pretty prevalent, right? So this kind of like the teacher, spending some time at the beginning of the day or, reading these stories particularly to younger children, I think, is kind of a very nice blending of these kind of two approaches. Get them outside and yet at the same time, pay attention to the reflective moment. I am interested though as well, like as I said, this is one of these projects where, I kind of stumbled into really. I kind of wrote a couple of essays which are online in Aeon magazine, and the writing of it like provoked this kind of inspection for me. So I'm kind of in some ways like kind of learning this field a little bit myself. So I am, as I said, meeting with particularly librarians around Chicago with help from the kind of central library itself, so that I can understand like how people are, how much reading are children doing. And I'm actually a little bit more assured than maybe I was coming into this, that the child with the book, even if it's on Kindle or an iPad, whatever, so the mechanism for delivery may have changed, but kids are still enchanted by story. And I'm optimistic that that's a perennial. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Oh, thank you.
Introduction to my question.
Sure.
I am a retired school psychologist. Back in the 70s and 80s, I was a Montessori teacher. And I remember back then, having very little science background, that our trainers invited a naturalist from Canada to come and speak with us about ecology, which was kind of a new idea back then. And for 3 days, she talked with us, and it like transformed my whole outlook on the world. And I've often thought, if there were, like a package program of something like that would be so helpful for adults. Right. And I'm wondering, other than TV programs and stuff, is there any kind of like a package program that people are taking around and kind of giving this overview in person to help people get connected with the environment?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. I mean, there are programs, of course, around Chicago, and I think it's true in cities around the world. Some of them are a little specialized. You can do like a naturalist certificate, which I think is open not to people who are necessarily working in natural resources, but to teachers, educators, or parents. That people will kind of do these repeated courses where you get that ecological knowledge and become skilled as kind of a natural historian. So you can do that as a certificate program. Morton Arboretum, I think the Chicago Botanic Garden has equivalent things. I know we're in conversation at the moment with the Field Museum about having an urban ecology lab that ultimately will have an education function. So I think you're kind of right in kind of recognizing that there's a paucity of these things, but it's a paucity that I think is kind of recognized as a real need. But I don't know as well. Like I do quite a bit of work with the Forest preserves, and you know, I was really entranced by, like, you know, the Cook County Forest Preserve's 100 event celebration of their centenary. So the Forest Preserve Cook County is now 100 years old. They had 100 events over a period of a week or so. And it was just a reminder to me of the number of nature centers and the amount of educational programming that's out there. The other kind of need, and maybe this is something that my students and I are working on, you know, so I'm kind of primarily, I would say, in this project an essayist, so I'm kind of reflecting on this. But we're also kind of working simultaneously on a set of curricular material. So, you know, so that a teacher could, you know, very precisely map on the content of these books. A lot of them are classics, as you noticed, but we're trying to get kind of modern classics and a lot more diversity as you know, as well. But to map on the content into explicit kind of information about curriculum. But the spirit of the question is excellent, because you're right. A lot needs to be done on that. A lot needs to be done.
You know, and I know you don't have enough time to answer this in full. I'm a 7th grade humanities teacher,
Yep.
and have been, it's my first year teaching that grade, from having taught very little kids. So I'm stepping into the world of literature there. But because I come from early elementary, I think, and I'm
Yeah.
used to teaching an integrated curriculum across everything, like being in charge of everything, I've brought in a lot of speakers, you know, environmental and whatever. My question is, so if you say that 1/3 of adults do not have adequate environmental literacy, like, could you just give us a quick ballpark? Like, what does that mean? Like, what makes an environmentally literate adult who has enough knowledge to guide kids through this literature to a real world understanding of it?
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's a terrific question, and you're right. Like, I mean, there's a lot to be said about it, but the, you know, the kind of regular survey evaluation, you know, of people's ecological, like environmental literacy, kind of, those metrics are developed from the literature on environmental literacy, which is now, you know, as I said, 45 years old, and it's that dense thicket of, you know, affect, attunement, ecological knowledge, and in you know, knowledge of environmentally responsible behaviors. So it's when I look at those instruments, they're, you know, it's certainly the case that many people who are trained ecologists would have difficulty acing those tests. So some of them are kind of, it's a pretty high metric, but I think, though, you know, it seems like it is the case that, like, you know, having fundamental understanding of how kind of earth processes work, having a fundamental understanding of what the really salient environmental problems are at the moment. And it's not just climate change, although climate change is kind of, you know, is a big priority. And then having knowledge of kind of particularly the type of policy instruments and the kind of political action that needs to be taken in order for us to implement things, that seems to be lacking. And can I just, as a little codicil, I have a T-shirt that says, that my students gave me, that says, can I say just one more thing? It's my bad habit, you know, but I do just want to say one more thing here, that the, you know, there are some environmental problems that we've done reasonably well. We solve environmental problems in two ways, right? I mentioned that I'd worked, like in the 80s on acid rain. You don't hear that term so much. We solved that because we renamed it. So acid rain is still a problem. We just renamed the problem, so it's now kind of concerns about nitrogen deposition. And nitrogen is a really sexy gas, but it, you know, problems with the nitrogen cycle are really significant, but virtually nobody knows kind of what we're facing in terms of nitrogen saturation of soils and the like. Really, really important. But but the other way in which we solve problems was like, you know, the problem with ozone depletion. again, there's still kind of problems, but, you know, an international policy instrument, the Montreal Protocol in '87, was pretty effective at phasing out CFCs, which were the gases ultimately responsible for stripping the ozone layer. So it's not like we can. I have too much to say about it, but like it's not like we can't solve problems. We can, but we've got to be aware of those problems in order to solve them, and that I think genuinely is what we're lacking. Yeah.
I'm going to follow up also, just because like that's the big thing in education, which is research has shown that you give kids a problem and you don't show them how to solve it, and what you end up with is apathetic adults.
Yeah.
Like you think about giving them all this knowledge, but what you're giving them is a sense of hopelessness.
Yeah.
So I think that that's the difficult thing in a classroom setting, is to give kids a real world way to affect
Yeah.
their adolescent emotional
And I think we can probably have a richer conversation with that over coffee hour.
Yep.
That's okay. I think there's a lot to say about that.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. As the parent of 11-year-old and 9-year-old who love to read, could you give me actual recommendations on how to engage them on these topics? And I was kind of surprised that I did not see Jack London on any of their books listed.
Yeah. So the project is based on there's about 150 books now that we're reading. Jack London is a personal big favorite of mine. I think I threw up like seven books there, but that is important. So, you know, ultimately, I think the recipe, right, is that the parent, needs to be environmentally literate in order to have those sort of conversations with the kid that are going to kind of draw out these themes. And yet at the same time, like, you know, as a parent myself, like, you know, the last thing, of course, that you want to do is, like, you know, have a ponderous conversation during story time. But I know, like, from my own kids and from the observations of others, that a favorite character, you know, comes up in conversation quite a bit. And there's a lot of opportunities based upon favorite stories to amplify it based upon kind of the knowledge of the parent, you know, what this might mean. And in particular, again, just the reminder that environmental literacy is not just about how we're all, I was going to say going to die, but I mean, we are of course, but you know, it's not all about like kind of, you know, calamitous outcomes. It's also about, you know, just the awe of being in nature and understanding, you know, what that sparrow is doing on the sidewalk. So the recommendation, of course, is to read these books, pretty much read the books that the kids are kind of liking anyway, and use kind of tools of environmental literacy to identify those things that are kind of worth having organic conversations about. Thank you.
Back here.
Given how politicized textbook selection is in this country, do you get a lot of pushback on your efforts to incorporate environmentalism into curricula?
Yeah, so I mean, this project is still a relatively new one for me. The book is going to come out of University of Chicago Press, and it's going to be, you know, so it should come out hopefully 2017. I'm a slow writer, not like Thoreau, but you know, so so ultimately, I haven't really kind of substantially engaged yet with trying to get stuff onto, in fact, like most of our work in kind of incorporating some of this into curricula have been with nature camps and summer camps. I think you're right. I think it'll end up being fiendishly difficult to get it into the kind of the day curriculum in schools, and I don't think I'm necessarily the right person to kind of, you know, that's something that I'm going to have to collaborate on. But I think it's a forceful point.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Besides encouraging environmental literacy, children learn by observing the adults that are important to them. In your own family, you've been very successful in doing this. what would be 5 personal habits that you have that you feel have influenced positively your children?
Yeah, so, that's a great question. We're big campers, and I know that's not kind of a, the only way of doing it, but, our family have always kind of carved out that time during summer in fact, we just came back from a camping trip up in Wisconsin last week. So that's important. The other big thing for me is, reading, of course. I think, children do pick up that kind of habit, from readerly parents, which, of course, with the atrophying of adult reading, that then becomes problematic. I don't know if I've got 5, but I really kind of would like to make a big push for walking, right? So I think, not to be too grandiose about it, but walking is a kind of a foundational methodology, like in terms of orienting yourself to the world around you. It's I don't know, just to give you an illustration, if you do a word search for walking in Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, it turns out the Voyage of the Beagle was much more a walking trip than it ever was a trip by sea. So natural historians and people who are interested in nature, walking is the right pace in which to encounter the world in a reflective way. So 3, is 3 enough?
I think we have time for one more question. Is there someone left who hasn't had a chance to ask one who wants to? Actually, I'll go with one of the newcomers, one of our visitors.
Thanks. Would you say that for children, a good presentation includes a blending of reality with fantasy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I would. So from the books that I've been reading, and as I said, like my main kind of way of finding those. So I'm reading a lot of books that are nostalgic favorites of mine, but they must be on kind of a list, kind of an objective list, or at least a list that's coming from a society or from a respected kind of like academic on kind of best literature for children. So as a result of that, the 150 or so books that I've been reading, they are so tremendously varied in their, in the stylistically. I mean, if you think, particularly, we haven't talked about it much, but when animals are anthropomorphized in fiction. So the prevalence, and that maybe gives my book its name, Beasts at Bedtime. Like there's a lot of animals that are anthropomorphized in children's literature. But it illustrates kind of maybe what you're asking about. I mean, sometimes, if you think about like Watership Down, they're kind of rabbits. I mean, they're warlike, like they're kind of odd rabbits. Even, I really, really like Beatrix Potter's series, which if you have not read recently, read the full Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit. I think ultimately Peter shows up in 4 stories. But Peter, of course, is kind of very real, right, in as much as it's based upon Potter's observation of the eponymous Peter Rabbit. So, there you have kind of, it's fantasy, of course, because of the scenario, but the characteristics of the animal are extremely real. I don't think anyone would be taking Winnie the Pooh as kind of a basis for understanding the natural history of bears. So it seems to me that, great books can make that blend in extremely heterogeneous ways. It's a lovely, lovely question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.